Hello, this is Brian Mercer for Author Magazine. Today I'm speaking with Jessica Maxwell, award-winning author of Roll Around Heaven, an all-true accidental spiritual adventure. So first off, I'd like you to start by talking about your road to becoming an established author. I'm thinking you went the very traditional route of writing for magazines before you were actually publishing books. That's right?
Yes, it is correct. And, looking back, I can see that had I had good literary counsel, I would have probably published my first book maybe a good 7 years before I did.
So you didn't have an agent with your first book?
Oh, I did. My history with agents is really rather fascinating. The first agent I got was in 1979. I was just out of college and I was working for the Los Angeles Times. And I had this idea about iridology. I've always been deeply kind of devoted to what I call real medicine, natural healing, natural medicine. I got this idea to do a story on iridology, which is the study of the iris of the eye, where different markings in the iris relate to different parts of your body, and you can actually do a diagnosis of what's going on in a body condition-wise. And I was working for the Los Angeles Times, and, in the afternoon, which would have been after hours New York time, I just, on a whim, picked up the phone and called Esquire's offices. And Lee Eisenberg, the editor-in-chief, was the only guy left who was working late, and he answered the phone. And
wow.
And I told him about it, and of course, there I was calling from the Los Angeles Times offices, so he took me and my call seriously, and he was intrigued with the idea, and I got this major feature assignment. So there I was with this gigantic feature story, and it was very visual with eyes of famous people, and just turned into this big deal. Well, Barbara Lowenstein read the story, and she is a famous New York agent, and she contacted me and said this should be a book.
Wow, so an agent contacted you. Now that's the way.
That always happens to me.
Now I'm going to pause and ask you this question.
Yeah.
As a nonfiction writer, and memoir side, but nonfiction writer, how necessary is it to have an agent? Obviously, it's better, but is it absolutely necessary?
Yes, it's absolutely necessary. The reason is that editors at big houses, at just good houses, will not look at manuscripts that are not represented by agents as a very general, deep rule. Have you seen a book contract lately?
Yeah.
They are complicated legal documents. My husband is an attorney, and I have a friend who's a publishing attorney, and both of them go over my contracts with a fine-tooth comb after or along with my agent going over it. I mean, it's complicated. You don't want to try to do it yourself. You'll get in big trouble. And we've all heard of writers who are so eager to be published that they sign things, and then you look back and they've signed away the right to retain their rights, and their book can be sold and sold and sold from this publisher to that publisher, and they get cut out of things. I mean, we've all heard true horror stories.
So your latest book, Roll Around Heaven, is a spiritual memoir,
mm-hmm.
and it takes place over 20 years?
16 years.
16 years, okay. So the whole time you weren't writing that the whole time? You were writing a journal and compiling it that way, or was it always in your mind to kind of make a book out of it?
In 1992, and so I was right in the middle of writing my Audubon column and doing my sporting. My father died, and exactly 3 days after he died, I was driving to go to a salmon fishing assignment in Alaska, and I looked up, and there was this kind of holographic projection in full Technicolor of my father's face filling the entire sky. And a lot of things shifted when I saw that. And one was, I knew he was talking to me, or he was telling me that he was okay. Some part of him still existed. Death was okay. I have no religious background. I was raised by 2 PhDs. We don't talk about these sorts of things. If you do, it's very in hushed tones with your very best friend.
So you're not at that point thinking, well, I'm going to write a book about
oh
this.
No. And in fact, I wasn't even going to tell anyone, but then my darn little sister called me in Alaska that night, and she called me to tell me that she'd seen Daddy's face in the sky. So I called Harper San Francisco, and they're now called Harper One, I believe. And they are the Mind, Body, and Spirit West Coast arm of HarperCollins in New York. An editor answered the phone call, and she said it sounded interesting. And so I sent her the manuscript that I had, and I probably had about 100 pages written by then. And I didn't hear from her, and I would call every once in a while and leave a message and feel like I was, I always try to not pester people. And then finally, out of the blue, 6 months later, I get a call from her, and she is all over herself with enthusiasm for Roll Around Heaven. The next phone call was with the publisher and this editor at Harper One. And we had this 1 hour talk, just a dream talk for any writer. And here's the publisher taking an hour of his precious time with my book. And so here's this big deal publisher just totally in love with Roll Around Heaven. All right. And then instead of that, what I got was a phone call from the editor, probably 2 weeks later. And she's all apologetic again. But this time she says, I can't believe I'm having to call you to tell you this. We can't buy your book because HarperCollins in New York, our mothership, has sent a mandate down from the top that says we cannot buy another book by a non-famous spiritual writer. Brutal. Devastating.
Well, devastating not only for so many reasons, but you had 2 weeks for it to sink in, and for the sense of success, and for you to tell people, and then it turns all around.
It turns all around. It was just awful. At that point, of course, after a really, really rainstorm of a cry,
sure.
I went and sat on our bed, and I went into the deep meditative prayers as I'm capable of, and I asked with all my heart, do you want me to do this book? Have I been deluding myself all these years? Maybe I'm not supposed to do this book. And I'm just weeping, and I'm as heart flung wide open as is humanly possible. And I'm sitting there, and the name Rita, R-I-T-A, comes flying into my head from nowhere. And I literally look up and I say, Rita? That's your answer, Rita? And then I remembered that I had made a friend in New York when I was on a magazine assignment in the 80s, and we're now in 2006. And I was doing a profile on the Flying Karamazov brothers, and they're performing in New York, and I went back to do this big profile on them, and they were working with Rita Rosencrantz as their book editor. She worked for Scribner's. And then about 10 years later, she contacted me to let me know she had become an agent, and if I ever needed representation, to contact her. And I had not thought of her, or, I was with this big famous New York agent for 7 years, and it didn't even occur to me. But I have to tell you, this was not my idea. It wasn't like I had it in the back of my mind and all of a sudden, this was an answer. Anyone who's ever heard it, very clearly it is not your own thinking. It's different. And of all things, a name? I was at least expecting a yes or a no. So I run to the computer and I look up Rita Rosencrantz, and there she is in her full glory, very established, a very big deal agent. So I immediately call the phone number and I leave a message, and she calls back fairly quickly, and she says, "Oh, Jessica, I've been following your work for years. You don't have to sell me on yourself. I'd be honored to represent you."
Wow.
And she's the one who sold Roll Around Heaven to Atria, Simon & Schuster, and Beyond Words, their Mind, Body, Spirit West Coast publisher out here.
So this is going to be an absurd question, but if the writers listening to your story might want to know this. So if there are writers out there who have been struggling for years to actually have a published work, and they hear your story and think, "Wow, how do I get these answers?" Can you give any specific advice, if someone would want to recreate this, what would you say?
Every single person's journey is original. And you don't want to try to replicate somebody else, but we can learn lessons from other people's journeys. And the number one thing that Western people don't do is ask.
So, but when you were in this state, and you were pretty, I would say at this point, I mean, you just had a pretty big disappointment. So you were pretty emotionally charged at that point.
Yes.
Correct. And at this point in time, you've had experience doing meditation. So you can listen, and you have some rapport with kind of your inner voice.
Yeah, you have to suit up and show up, don't you? Every single faith that human beings have created, the practice of that faith is designed to do what? To throw you into the right hemisphere of your brain. And whether it's chanting or dancing or singing or prayer or meditation, all of it throws you into the right side of your brain. And one of the books that I am telling everybody, especially writers, to read right now is Jill Bolte Taylor's My Stroke of Insight. And Jill Bolte Taylor is a neuroanatomist. She's literally a brain scientist. And when she was a young woman, she had a stroke. She fully recovered, thank goodness. But while she was having the stroke, she got to be a brain scientist observing herself having a stroke, right? Mm-hmm. And the whole entire left hemisphere of her brain filled up with blood and was inoperable. And what that means is that there is no critical thinking. There's no speech. She couldn't think sequentially. And she was fully only aware of what was going on in the right hemisphere of her brain. And guess what she experienced? She experienced everything she could see as being a part of the rest of it. She experienced this hackneyed spiritual term of oneness. But that's how she experienced the world. And she also experienced the deepest peace she'd ever felt in her life. And she felt as though she were enveloped in pure love. And I think it took her about 8 years to fully recover, but she went back to being a brain scientist, and she wrote this book as her offering, her spiritual offering to the world, because she knows from personal experience that we all carry in the right hemispheres of our brains this direct access to what we, in our attempt to put words on this thing is spirituality, our direct access to the experience of the divine or the spiritual or the source. We are it. We carry it. But we're in such a culture that historically has drummed it into our head to be linear, to be left-brained. And you have to some extent, of course. That's the intellect. That's where you're going to be a good editor. You have to read what just came through and go, I got to edit that or trim that up or add something there. And so somebody asked her, well, you're a brain scientist, so you're doing left brain work a lot. How do you stay centered? And she said, it's easy. When I'm getting too stressed out or angry or whatever, I meditate, and I know how to slide right back into the right side of my brain, and that's where peace dwells.
And so it's more than just shutting off your mind and listening. It's something deeper.
Yes, and it's something that you already have. What I'm saying is that if we want to have our literary problems solved, if we want help with those things, whether it's I need an agent, how do I find an agent? I'm stuck with this chapter, I don't know how to finish it. I need a new idea for a book. Anything you can think of. When I ask people, well, have you asked? And they know what I mean by that. They say, gosh, you would have thought I would have thought of the obvious.
So when you say, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but when you say ask, can you be very specific?
Yes.
What did you ask?
Well, what the specifics are, with full, absolute, emotional honesty. and power. I sat down and I absolutely asked in my mind, and I mean, some people do it verbally. I use my thoughts. Do you want me to write this book? Am I wrong? Have I been wrong all these years? Is this a book that is not supposed to be? And I'm asking to be shown what to do, for a sign, or at least to say, well, yes, this is a mistake or something. And by sitting there, and you really got it right, with dramatic emotional power, I sat there and I asked, and I was also fully open to receive whatever the answer is going to be. The answer was Rita. Now, I can't promise that if you do that, you might get the name of an agent.
Right, exactly.
But that's not the point. The point isn't the specific content. The point is the process.
When I was shopping for, my Oversoul Incorporated, looking for an agent, and I was getting rejection, and I was having lunch with my wife, and I said to her, you know what? I just want someone to ask for the manuscript. They don't have to take it. I just want the validation of someone saying, this is good enough. I want to read your story. And it had been after months and months and months of rejection.
Right.
And I went back to the office. There was an email from an agent that said, I love this. Please send me the manuscript.
Oh, my gosh.
Now, she didn't ended up taking it.
But that's not what you asked for.
I didn't ask. That's what I asked for. I just want someone to, and I specifically said, I don't care if they take it or not. I just want someone to validate that this is good. And I got that answer. I wasn't even praying. I was just kind of telling my wife, this is what I want.
But see, I think it's all prayer.
Yeah.
Because you're asking. It's asking. It's the big thing people don't do. And you asked. That's the point. Right? And I wasn't asking for the name of an agent. I was asking a much, much bigger question, but I got the right answer, which was I had the wrong agent, you see, and the right agent knew where to take this book.
So it might not necessarily be an answer like you ask a question and you get a response. The response may just be action. It may be that something happens, and that's your answer.
Yeah. Whether you want to believe it or not, just go with that, because it happens to be true, and it will prove it to yourself. Prove it to you. But when you really align with that and trust it and go with it, the answers, the help, the surprises, the delightful, assistance, it's nothing you could have dreamt up.
Sure.
And so
one of the things I really like about your story is that you are an established writer who not only has had an agent but has had agents, famous agent, in more than one, and with successful books, and here you have a book that you want to sell, and you're experiencing the same frustration as so many people who've just written and have had no success yet, and yet you persevere, and 7 years or however many years later it does manifest. It eventually does manifest, and you didn't give up. You kept going, and so many people who at some point get frustrated and say, you know what, I'm no good, it's not going to work. If you had said that somewhere in the process.
And note, I could have said that. At that time, I could have, when I sat down and asked, what the heck should I do? Or should I even be doing this? When I really questioned for the first time, I literally questioned the entire project. And so you can't give up. Now, there's always the question of, is this book written well enough? But golly, I don't know about you. I have picked up, I'm in 3 book clubs, and we have read, you know where I'm going. We have read so many books. I want to throw them across the room because they're so poorly written. So if they can get published with a big publishing house, I figure anybody can.
Precisely, and that is a frustrating thing when you have people out there who, many if not all our listeners, can say the same thing about their work. That wow, this is way better than some of the stuff that's published out there.
Yeah.
There really is a higher source maybe guiding that. And when you look back in retrospect, when they turned you down at, would you say, Harper One? Well,
now it's called. They changed the name from Harper San Francisco to Harper One.
Harper One. When you were turned down there, And you look, if everything happens for a reason, what would you say would be the reason for that? Because certainly, if
I know what it is.
If the book was meant to happen, that you could have found, the right editor without needing to go through that turmoil. What was the reason?
Timing. This book, Roll Around Heaven, has come out into the world at exactly the right time.
If you were going to give advice to writers who are struggling and who want to be inspired to continue and to be successful, what would you tell them?
What you really want to do for the quality of your work, for the quality of your ideas, and for help to getting your precious art out into the world is to establish a relationship with that mystery that I can tell you is there to help you if you let it.
One of the things that was true of you, that you mentioned several times, and I think what happens to people is that they start writing because they like to write, and they have a story they want to tell, so they do that, and at some point in time they decide, you know what, I think I could publish this. I think this is good. So they go on they stray from the bath and they go and they try to get it published, and then pretty soon they lose focus because they were successful in writing it, so they've written it, but they assume they're going to be successful getting it published, and it gets really frustrating, and they get so focused on the publishing part of it that the writing kind of goes by the wayside, and they get distracted with the publishing part of it. And you said yourself, it was always about the writing, about the process, and I think it's so important to remember why you're doing it.
Yes, it was always about my passion for the story, for the idea. And that's what always drove me. As I said, to the point that it would have been smarter to have said, well, gosh, if I could get my name known, then I'd get more creative freedom, and I wouldn't have to, fight so hard to get the next story out there. And but that's how in love I am with the creative process, itself. And you reminded me of something. I don't know how many years ago this Olympics. It was a Winter Olympics, and Katarina Witt was skating, and somebody else, and the third skater was supposed to be the bronze. The big Olympic shootout was between Katarina Witt from Germany and an American skater, I think. And those two got so competitive and so tied in knots about who was going to get the gold that they both totally screwed up. And the third one, the one who wasn't supposed to be successful except maybe get a bronze, she got out there and she skated better than anybody, and she took the gold medal. And when she was interviewed afterwards, they said, what in the world happened? And she said, well, I was getting all caught up in the competition too, and so I went to a counselor, and the counselor said, listen, just go out there and skate for the joy of it. That's why you started skating in the first place. So she skated for the joy of it, and she won the gold medal.
You hear the stories where people want to get pregnant, and they try, and then they let it go, and then it happens, or they're looking for the partner of their dreams, and it doesn't happen until for years and years, and they say, well, I give up, and then it happens. And so I think there's a component of it that you have to let it go and just let the universe kind of bring it in. This was a great interview. Thank you, Jessica. This was Brian Mercer for Author Magazine, and I've been speaking with Jessica Maxwell, author of Roll Around Heaven, an all-true accidental spiritual adventure.